You've probably cracked open an egg the exact same way for most of your life, same pan, same heat, same few minutes on the stove. But somewhere along the way, without anyone telling you, the way your body handles that egg quietly changed. And that's the part almost nobody explains. I'm Dr. Robert Vance, and if you're over 65, there's a good chance you've been eating eggs a certain way for decades simply because it's always worked. Nobody questions breakfast. It's the one meal that runs on autopilot. But a few small details about eggs matter differently once you're past 60, and most of them have nothing to do with the egg being bad for you. They have to do with what's changed in your body, your medications, and your daily routine since you first learned how to cook one. So here's what we're going to do. We're going through 7 common mistakes older adults make with eggs one at a time, and for each one, I'll explain why it happens, why it may matter more now, and what you might want to consider instead. None of this is about guilt. It's about giving you the kind of information that lets you keep enjoying your breakfast with a little more confidence behind it. Now, I want to be clear about something before we start. This isn't a list designed to make you nervous about breakfast. Eggs remain one of the most practical, affordable, and genuinely useful foods available to older adults, and nothing you're about to hear changes that. What changes is the fine print, the small details around how, when, and how much. And those details tend to matter more the longer we live. You may recognize yourself in one of these 7. You may recognize a parent, a spouse, or a close friend. Either way, think of this less as a checklist of failures and more as a set of small course corrections. The kind that take almost no effort but quietly add up over months and years. Let's start in the kitchen with something a lot of people do without thinking twice. Picture a soft, runny yolk, the kind you get when you pull the egg off the heat just a little early. For a lot of people, that's not just a preference, it's practically a tradition. Maybe your mother made eggs that way. Maybe it's just the texture you've always loved. Here's the thing though, as we get older, the immune system can become a little less efficient at fighting off certain bacteria, including salmonella, which can occasionally be present in eggs that haven't been fully cooked. When you were 35, your body could usually shake off that kind of exposure without much trouble. At 70, the same exposure can sometimes turn into something that takes longer to recover from and hits harder while it lasts. That doesn't mean the runny yolk you've eaten for 40 years was some kind of ticking time bomb. It almost certainly wasn't. But the odds have shifted slightly, the same way a lot of small odds shift as we age. And it's worth knowing that if you love that texture, pasteurized eggs are worth looking into, since they let you keep the soft yolk while lowering the risk. Otherwise, simply cooking the egg a bit longer until both the white and yolk are fully set closes that gap almost entirely. This is also true for foods you might not immediately connect to eggs, things like homemade mayonnaise, certain salad dressings, or eggnog made the old-fashioned way, all of which sometimes rely on raw egg. None of these need to disappear from your kitchen. It's simply worth knowing which recipes carry a bit more risk than others now, so you can decide for yourself whether pasteurized eggs make sense for that particular dish. Picture a holiday gathering where a homemade eggnog gets passed around the table, the same recipe that's been in the family for generations. Nobody thinks twice about it because nobody ever got sick from it before. That's completely believable, and it doesn't mean anything needs to change this year. But knowing that pasteurized eggs exist gives you the option to make that same recipe with one ingredient swapped, keeping the tradition intact while quietly lowering the risk for everyone at the table, especially the older guests. Now, here's a mistake that has almost nothing to do with the egg itself and everything to do with what's sitting right next to it on the plate. 2 eggs, a couple strips of bacon, buttered toast. It's a classic. It's comforting. And on its own, no single piece of that plate is some kind of villain. The issue shows up when that exact combination happens morning after morning after morning for years without much variation. Sodium and saturated fat add up differently as we age. Blood pressure regulation often becomes more sensitive over time, and heart health tends to move higher up the list of things worth paying attention to. A breakfast that barely registered at 40 can carry more weight at 70, not because the eggs changed, but because your body's relationship with sodium and fat likely has. I've talked to people who eat eggs every single morning, consider it a healthy habit, and then feel completely blindsided when a doctor mentions their blood pressure. The eggs were rarely the actual problem. It was everything traveling alongside them. The fix here isn't giving up eggs, it's looking at what's next to them. Swapping processed breakfast meats for something leaner, leaning on herbs instead of salt, and folding in a handful of spinach, or some sliced tomato, can turn the same basic meal into one that's working with you instead of against you. None of this requires giving up the flavors you actually enjoy. A little smoked paprika, black pepper, or fresh chives can replace a lot of the salt shaker without you noticing much of a difference in taste. The goal isn't a bland plate. It's the same satisfying breakfast, just built with a slightly different set of ingredients standing next to the eggs. Think about the last time you stood in the grocery store looking at packaged breakfast meats. The label usually lists sodium content per serving, but almost nobody stops to actually read it because it's such a routine purchase. Next time you're there, take 30 seconds to compare a couple of options side by side. You'll often find a real difference between brands, and sometimes the leaner, lower sodium choice costs about the same as the one you've always bought out of habit. Let's talk about something you were probably told decades ago, because there's a good chance it's stuck with you ever since. For years, the advice around eggs and cholesterol was simple, direct, and repeated so often it became almost automatic. Limit your eggs, watch your yolks, cholesterol is the enemy. If you grew up hearing that, you likely still carry some version of that caution with you today, even if you can't remember exactly where you first heard it. Here's what's changed. Research has examined the relationship between the cholesterol in eggs and the cholesterol in your blood. And for most people, that relationship is far less direct than the older guidance suggested. Many health professionals today consider moderate egg consumption a reasonable part of a balanced diet for people without specific cholesterol-related conditions. I've met people who haven't touched an egg in 15 years because of something they were told back in the 80s, completely unaware that the broader guidance has shifted since then. Meanwhile, they're missing out on a genuinely useful source of protein at exactly the stage of life when protein matters more, not less. If this sounds like you, it's worth a real conversation with your own doctor about your specific cholesterol numbers and health history rather than relying on advice that may be 30 or 40 years old. It's worth remembering that guidance around food evolves as research improves, and that's not a sign the earlier advice was careless. It simply means our understanding got more precise over time. There's no shame in having followed the old guidance faithfully for decades. The only real mistake would be never revisiting it now that the picture has become clearer. Consider a common situation. A woman in her early 70s orders egg white omelets every time she eats breakfast out, has done so for years, and has never once questioned why. When she finally asks her doctor about it directly, she learns her cholesterol numbers have actually been well within a healthy range the entire time. She could have been enjoying whole eggs the whole time, yolk included, without any real trade-off. That's not a rare story. It's an extremely common one, and it usually only changes once someone finally asks a question out loud. Now here's something that rarely gets mentioned at all, and it has to do with how much you're actually eating, not just what. Quick question. When you think about a normal breakfast portion, is that based on how you eat now or how you ate 20 years ago? For most people, it's the second one, and that gap matters more than you'd expect. As we get older, the body naturally loses some muscle over time, a process called sarcopenia. In plain terms, that means the muscle you rely on for getting out of a chair, carrying groceries, or climbing a flight of stairs can gradually decline if it isn't actively supported. Protein plays a real role in slowing that decline. And here's the part that surprises people. Older adults often need more protein per meal, not less, to get the same muscle supporting benefit that a younger body gets more easily. So if breakfast has always meant one egg and a slice of toast, that portion may quietly be doing less for you than it once did simply because your needs moved and the portion didn't. Bumping that up to 2 or 3 eggs or adding something like Greek yogurt or cottage cheese on the side is a small change with a fairly direct payoff. Think of it like a savings account. A slightly bigger deposit at breakfast, made consistently, adds up to something real over time. And this doesn't have to mean a plate piled high with food you don't have an appetite for. Appetite naturally shifts as we age too, so if a bigger breakfast doesn't sound appealing, even small additions help. A spoonful of cottage cheese on the side or a slice of turkey folded into an omelet can close a meaningful part of that gap without asking you to eat more than feels comfortable. There's also a timing piece worth mentioning. Spreading protein more evenly across breakfast, lunch, and dinner tends to support muscle maintenance better than loading most of it into one meal later in the day, which is a common pattern for people who skip breakfast or keep it light. If mornings have always felt like the meal you rush through, giving it just a little more attention may do more for your strength and energy than you'd expect. Here's a mistake that has nothing to do with eating the egg at all. It happens before the egg ever hits the pan. A lot of us grew up watching eggs sit out on the counter, or judging freshness with a quick sniff rather than a date on the carton. It's not a careless habit. It's just what got passed down, and it's never caused an obvious problem, so there's never been a reason to question it. But again, that aging immune system we talked about earlier comes back into play here. Eggs stored improperly or kept well past their useful window carry a slightly higher chance of bacterial growth. Combine that with a body that may take longer to bounce back from foodborne illness, and a habit that was low risk in your 30s becomes a little less worth the gamble in your 70s. The fix is almost embarrassingly simple. Keep your eggs in the main body of the refrigerator, not the door, since the door tends to run warmer with every open and close. Leave them in their original carton and try to use them within 3 to 5 weeks of purchase. No new equipment, no extra cost, just a small shift in where the carton sits. If you're ever unsure whether an egg is still good, there's a simple trick worth knowing. Place it in a bowl of water. An egg that sinks and lays flat is fresh. One that stands upright or floats has aged past its best and is worth skipping. It takes 10 seconds and beats guessing. Buying habits matter here too. If a large carton sits in your fridge for weeks because you're only using 1 or 2 eggs at a time, a smaller carton bought more often might actually serve you better than a bulk pack that always seems to have a few stragglers left near the end. It's a small adjustment to how you shop, not just how you store, but it closes the same gap from a different angle. This next one surprises almost everyone I mention it to because it has nothing to do with digestion or cholesterol at all. If you're taking a blood thinner like warfarin, there's a decent chance nobody has ever mentioned this to you because eggs feel far too ordinary to come up in a conversation about medication. But the yolk contains vitamin K, a nutrient involved in blood clotting, and for people on certain blood thinners, consistency in vitamin K intake matters more than the amount itself. This isn't about avoiding eggs if you're on that kind of medication. It's about not swinging wildly between eating a lot of eggs one week and none the next, since that kind of inconsistency can affect how well the medication is working. Health professionals commonly recommend keeping vitamin K intake fairly steady rather than eliminating it, and this is exactly the kind of detail worth mentioning to your doctor or pharmacist if you're on a blood thinner and eggs are a regular part of your diet. It costs nothing to ask, and it closes a gap that almost never gets addressed on its own. This is really just one example of a much bigger idea, which is that ordinary foods can interact with medications in ways that rarely make it into everyday conversation. You don't need to memorize a list of interactions. You simply need to know that it's worth asking the question, especially for foods you eat often and consistently. Think about someone who was recently prescribed a blood thinner after a health scare, and whose doctor spent most of the appointment focused on the bigger, more obvious concerns. Diet questions about something as ordinary as eggs rarely make it into that conversation, simply because there's only so much time and so many topics to cover. That's not a failure on anyone's part. It's just a gap that's easy to fill yourself with one quick question at your next appointment or your next pharmacy visit. And that brings us to the last point, which ties everything else together. At some point, every breakfast habit stopped being a decision and became a routine. You don't wake up and choose eggs the way you did the first time. You just have them the same way, because that's simply what breakfast is. That's not a flaw. That's just how habits work once they've had decades to settle in. But your body at 70 isn't your body at 40. Your activity level may look different. Your appetite may have shifted. Your priorities around health may have changed entirely. A breakfast that made complete sense 20 years ago might still make sense today, or it might be quietly out of step with where you actually are right now. And there's no way to know unless you occasionally stop and look at it with fresh eyes. This isn't a suggestion to overhaul your mornings. It's simply a nudge to treat breakfast as something you're choosing, even if the choice ends up being exactly what you've always had. There's a real difference between a habit you've never questioned and a habit you've looked at and decided still fits. Sometimes that fresh look changes nothing at all, and that's a perfectly good outcome too. The point was never to force change for its own sake. The point is simply making sure the choice is actually yours, made with today's body and today's life in mind, rather than a decision that was made for you decades ago and never revisited since. Maybe your mornings look completely different now than they did when you were working full-time and raising a family. Perhaps you have more time now, or perhaps grandchildren visit, and breakfast has become something you look forward to sharing with them. Either way, that shift in your daily life is exactly the kind of thing worth letting your breakfast catch up to, rather than holding on to a routine built for a schedule you no longer keep. So let's bring all of this together. Cook the egg a little more thoroughly. Pay attention to what's sitting next to it on the plate. Revisit cholesterol guidance you may have learned decades ago. Consider whether your protein at breakfast still matches what your body needs today. Keep your eggs stored properly. Mention them to your doctor if you're on a blood thinner. And every so often, take a second look at whether your morning routine still reflects the life you're living now, not the one you were living 30 years ago. None of this means you've been doing anything wrong. It means your body has changed the way everyone's does, and understanding that gives you more control over your choices, not less. I also want to say this clearly. You don't need to act on all 7 points today or even this month. Pick the one that felt most relevant to your own life, the one where you caught yourself nodding along, and start there. Small, single changes tend to stick far better than trying to overhaul everything about your breakfast at once. Give yourself permission to move at whatever pace feels manageable, because a habit that lasts for 6 months does more for you than a dramatic change that fades after a week. And if none of these 7 applied to you, that's a genuinely good sign. It means you're already handling this particular part of your health thoughtfully, and this video simply confirmed what you were already doing right. That, in the end, is really what this channel is about. Not overhauling your life, not chasing the latest trend, but taking the everyday things you already do, the breakfast you already eat, the routines you already follow, and understanding them just a bit more clearly. That understanding is what lets you keep doing the things you love for longer and with more confidence in every choice along the way. Which of these 7 caught you off guard? Tell me in the comments. I'd genuinely like to know which one you hadn't considered before. And if this kind of practical, no-nonsense health information is useful to you, go ahead and subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of thing we cover here week after week. Getting older doesn't mean giving up the things you enjoy. It means understanding them a little more clearly, so you can keep enjoying them, breakfast included, with a bit more knowledge behind every choice. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.